Okay, so in the first video, we talked a bit about mental state and physical state in older adulthood. And part of the reason for belaboring the biological issues here is because mental state and physical state are very much tied throughout our lives, but it's particularly apparent in old age. Um, so biological changes related to old age that we can expect to see in terms of behavior is that people behave more slowly. There's a slowing of the central nervous system, so ability to function, particularly with your extremities, right? Um, Response rates are going to go down. People have lower energy levels overall. Sleep cycles may change, especially in later old age. People sleep more. Sensory perception changes, we also talked about that. So how people engage and what they engage in may change because of the changes in their senses. And there also may be some problems with the cardiovascular system, making physical movement more of a problem. Okay, so one of the things that we have as a stereotype of older folks in some communities is that there is a decline in IQ. Um, this decline is not backed by research until very late in life. And it is decline is most evident where speed of response is important, right? As we talked about the slowing of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system in particular. So if I have to push a button every time I uh, respond to something as a yes or a no, will look like I am less quick, and if quick is how we're judging intelligence, which it sometimes is um, in Western definitions of intelligence, um, I would look like I was doing less well. Um, there's also increase in problems for folks who have diseases that attack the central nervous system, or folks who are not doing much. This summer, I have been spending a lot of my time delivering meals to folks who are shut in, who cannot leave, particularly because of coronavirus, but also because of mobility issues, ability or inability to drive, etc. Um, can't or don't leave their homes. In which case, they're not having many conversations. They're not doing much new. A lot of the time, they're spending watching the television. So if you're having lower inputs, less problem solving to do, um, this is related to decline in IQ. So we call these impoverished environments. Okay, when we are comparing younger adults to older adults, we also tend to see problems here because younger adults have more practice taking the kinds of tests that we tend to use for IQ and more recently. So that leads into some cohort effects. If we test folks in their late or in their 20s on IQ tests, they are much more likely to have taken some similar type of test in the last 5 years, whereas older adults may never have been exposed to those kinds of tests, period, right, based on access to education in their cohort, or may not have had any experience with it in the recent past. There's a lot of difference in how much people decline and what kinds of declines are substantial. Again, variability at this point, when we're talking about decline in IQ, decline in memory, is going to depend a lot on what other kind of secondary aging things are going on with you, not just number of years on the planet. So there's also some qualitative changes in cognition. Older adults seem to use different memory strategies than younger adults. Unclear due to research whether this is based on cohort effects or the changes in the brain as we age. Um, Older adults are more likely to use both hemispheres in remembering things. They're more likely to remember positive information and indeed show preferential looking towards happy uh, versus sad faces. Some research has suggested that if folks are interrupted, that this positivity bias goes away. So this may be effortful as opposed to automatic. So memory in old age. Another thing that we expect to decline in old age. There are some areas of memory that regularly decline as we age. And we're talking about normative aging. So not dementia, not Alzheimer's, that's a whole nother thing. But normative aging. So there's some areas that decline. There are other areas that are relatively untouched. So we tend to see declines in working memory and episodic memory, and remembering the source of info. And some people have argued using the information processing approach to cognition that these declines have to do with our ability to retrieve or refresh info that we have stored. Also, we may have trouble networking or binding information together, so it's harder to access previous memories because the ties between those and new memories are not as strong. So some things that seem to be relatively normative and untouched by aging are procedural memory. So if my 93-year-old grandma had the balance and the muscle control to ride a bike, she would remember how to ride a bike. So it is likely that her procedural memory would be there. Um, the speed of her movements because of peripheral nervous system damage over time is not going to help her to ride a bike. But procedurally, knowing how to do it, she would know how to do it. Short-term memory seems to be relatively untouched. Again, this is for folks who are not experiencing Alzheimer's or dementia. Semantic knowledge. We may actually see improvements in semantic knowledge. So this is knowledge about facts. What is the capital of Oregon? So for example. We also tend to conserve our memory specifically for events that are highly emotional. And this could be both positive and negative. Although in relating our memories and research, we see again that positivity bias that folks are going to focus on positive events and retelling the events of their lives. Okay, so what do we see in learning? In learning, we see in late adulthood errors of omission and commission. So adding articles to a category or individual things to a category that don't necessarily belong there. An omission would be losing things out of a category. This is common in memory by category in all ages, but we see it especially for later adulthood. Metacognition and mnemonics can be really helpful for older adults for remembering things. However, we don't get as much practice with these as we do in later adulthood as we have in younger adulthood. So they may be out of practice with their mnemonics. They're thinking about how they think. Again, these are things that have been highlighted in schools in the last few decades, and so if folks who are in old age now may have missed out on those. Also, they haven't done this as much recently. And then lastly, folks are going to do a better job at learning things that are functional. So if it's clear to them why they are learning it. Again, this is a thing that's pretty consistent across ages, but folks who have more recent experience going to school and learning things for learning's sake or learning things for a grade may be able to kind of set that aside and learn because you've asked them to learn something, as opposed to older adults who are like, well, what's the point? Why am I doing this? Okay, some other issues in late adulthood. Um, because of stigma and stereotypes, older adults may lack confidence in their ability to remember things, to learn stuff. Again, because of slowing of the central nervous system, if you are judging their learning and whether they have learned or not based on time, uh, they're likely to fall behind. So if we are kind of timing their responses, they will look like they have not learned as much. Again, that function over just conceptual knowledge, the meaningfulness of the task matters. Um, Interference. So if you are working with a slower processing speed and you get interrupted, that interruption is more likely to be problematic for you getting your train of thought back on track, so to speak, and being able to pick up where you left off. So interference or disruption can be harder. Also, some of the multitasking that we were able to do younger or earlier in life is much harder at this point. So social factors, ageism kind of leads into or falls into that whole lack of self-confidence as well, um, but also lack of recent test-taking experience. Okay, so and then lastly, talking a little bit about social roles in late adulthood, it is really common in late adulthood for folks to lose loved ones. This is a quote from my grandma. She said, "It's hard when you get old. So many of my friends have passed on," which she, in her sweet little cheery Southern drawl, said, I think I know more people who's dead than who's alive." Um, she's awesome. But this is part of life, right? You know a lot of folks and can remember a lot of folks that have passed on. So this can be very sobering, uh, depressing. This is going to make you think about your own death, part of late adulthood. Often, one of those loved ones that people lose is their partner or spouse. And previously, we had talked about losing roles, or the idea that you gain roles and lose roles, and then you might lose the role of spouse. For spouses that have been together for a long time, and even for spouses who have not, um, your partners become very key to your daily life. So there's a deep loneliness and can be very isolating. Your routines may have to change, and that can be kind of awkward or disorienting. Um, there are fewer social supports available in late adulthood because many of someone's friends may have passed on, so they may not have as strong or as kind of populous a social network. Women are more likely to lose a partner or a spouse than men are in heterosexual relationships. Um, and women have been socialized generally to talk about this, to seek support. So that is good, but that may also, because there are fewer um, men who become widowed than women, that may be more, mean that that's a greater risk for them. Um, another social role that folks may move into in later adulthood is starting to become a caregiver for their spouse. So renegotiating their roles with their spouse of trying to care for them, feed them, toilet them, etc. And this can be really stressful, not only because it is a reminder that that person may be passing on, may be dying, but also because it requires renegotiating roles. So somebody who you love and respect and who may need help washing their hands now, right? So these are difficult transitions. Um, we also see that folks are starting to, or may lose a partner, lose in quotations, to dementia or Alzheimer's. And this is really difficult in that the person is often physically present, but not emotionally or cognitively present, and that can be really difficult. So to be a caregiver, but not have the relationship as the support and the kind of the benefit, right, for the reward, even sort of for that caregiving. Also, many folks in later adulthood become care receivers. So, starting to be cared for by children, or by folks outside of the family. And that is a different, also difficult social role to kind of negotiate. Okay, so again, age related changes are variable. There's a lot of difference between individuals in what we see in terms of what physiological, socio-emotional, and cognitive uh, behavior looks like in older age. We can take into account somebody's diet, whether they lived through the Great Depression, which was a time of scarcity in terms of nutrients, but also for some folks, they weren't able to go to school. There may have been really high stress. They may have been homeless. Um, Depression, the Great Depression was a big stressor. Um, Differences in heredity. I have really bad cholesterol, but I don't eat meat and I exercise every day. Um, Heredity, yay! So some of that may be not behavioral. Also, education, socioeconomic status may influence how well you do over time. So while we call 65 years and up, or have historically called 65 years and up old age, um, there's nothing physiological or psychological that changes right at 65. This is more again about social roles and starting to move into a different space of life than middle adulthood. Um, the other thing is that people are very flexible and very adaptive. So even if you had a really bad diet or went through a very traumatic experience, how you recover may make you look different from other folks who had or didn't have that experience. So it's really hard to predict where someone's going to be at this age. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to my grandmothers. My late grandmother Velma and my grandma Mary. Um, the reason that I point these women out is because they're awesome, but also because they went through very different things in their later life. Both women in this picture was taken in 2007. And Mary, at this point, was hosting weekly family dinners with the whole family over to her house. She and her husband would prepare dinner for all of her kids who were in the area and all of their kids. So, grandkids, everybody would go over to her house. It was an open invitation every Wednesday. Velma, we saw at her birthday and Christmas, um, and both grandmas attended church, but the amount of social engagement between was really different between Velma and Mary. Um, in the time since this picture was taken, both of these women became widowed. um, Velma seems to have made the choice that uh, she was either going to follow her husband um, quickly behind, or she was going to make some changes in her life. And so she rededicated to eating healthy and got more involved in church and Bible study, and she was playing the bells. So she reintegrated and got much healthier. Um, Lost a bunch of weight, and got more socially active. Mary, her husband before she was widowed, was had pretty bad dementia, and for quite a while she was his sole caregiver. This took a huge toll on her. She also had lymphoma, Um, and so both of these left her significantly isolated, because she didn't feel like she could share how much caregiving she was doing for her husband. She didn't want to embarrass him. It was very stressful, and that took a big toll on her. So whereas Mary was doing much better in terms of social engagement, cognitive engagement, when this picture was taken, she had a rough 10 years following this. Um, uh, Velma passed 2 years ago. Towards the end, had pretty severe depression. Mary is uh, living in a assisted living place where she has a boyfriend. She regularly goes to uh, workout classes, and beats the socks off of everybody in poker, apparently. So there's while there were lots of different things going on in these women's lives, right? There's differences in SES in terms of who grew up with more money, who grew up with less. That was stressors when they were children, as well as stressors as they became widowed, and moved into late adulthood. Um, if you had to look at these women and think about these women's stories, which would you say is older? So the answer there is that Mary is older by about 3 years. So not a ton. But given the way they look in the picture, the description of their lives, it's hard to tell. And that's the point, right? Late adulthood is variable across individuals. Okay, so we'll leave it there and we'll go on to the next video 3 here in a second.